Jim, as your reward during your Q&A session, we have a lapel mic for you so you can finish your walkabout.
Okay. I was normally being audible is not my problem. I used to have, when I taught undergraduates, they would move back in the room as the class went on in time. So, but the problem is indeed, if you want to catch anything. Is there any questions?
Okay, yeah, we have about 10 minutes now.
Right.
Why don't we start with the forum? So we'll start with Michael, and then I'll get you two afterwards. If you want to go up to the mic, though, while you're waiting, that would be great.
Thanks a lot for a very interesting talk. My interest is in impulsiveness. We do this a lot with suicide research. And I'm wondering how these circuits, and of course impulsiveness interacts with alcohol in increasing the likelihood of this type of self-harm behavior, and one presumes also harm of others' behavior. How do those circuits and that genetics interact with the models that you were talking about?
So that's non-trivial to answer. In fact, actually, when I very carefully forgot to talk about suicide, even though I said I might talk about it, but I very carefully forgot. So with respect to the amygdala responsiveness, that basic threat, I mean, the very simplest answer is that it cannot directly map onto suicide, simply because that architecture we understand so clearly, amygdala, hypothalamus, PAG, does not generate self-harm behaviors in any mammalian species that anybody's ever looked at least that I know about. Having said that, if we just look at the top end of it, that amygdala response, there, you know, it's clearly associated with, I mean, I showed you a whole bunch of disorders associated with reactive aggression. But all of those disorders are also associated with an increased risk for suicide. Oh, I'm just going to give you this part first off, and then I'm going. So there you've got something that may actually, but it may represent that, or alternatively, it may represent just a, you know, if you have the issues that give rise to suicide, you also have problems there, as well as having these problems that I'm identifying as well. The other thing I would note, though, that does point towards something to do with that amygdala responsiveness being related to an increased risk is that patients with those callous unemotional traits who have that decreased response to threat and to the sadness of other individuals are at reduced risk for suicide, at least according to the literature as it exists. Having said that, again, it must be much different. The computational process has to be different because that basic architecture cannot be driving, at least as we understand the animal work, cannot be driving self-harm behaviors. You then asked about impulsivity, which is a non-trivial concept in itself. I mean, that reactive aggression is one form of impulsive behavior, but that's very different from you know, things you might see in a motor inhibition task, and very different from, in fact, the decision-making architecture. If that's dysfunctional, you'll see choice of immediate rewards over better, longer-term rewards. So I'm cautious to talk about impulsiveness because there's so many different computational processes. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that decision-making architecture being dysfunctional does contribute to your risk. I did very briefly do a search on some, at least suicide attempters studies that did point towards that architecture being the reward punishment-based decision-making architecture being dysfunctional. And you can certainly imagine when you're doing your cost-benefit analysis that at least for some individuals, it is a failure to do appropriate cost-benefit analysis. But again, I think it's, I think it's an easier job doing it for aggression because you can say, look, we stimulate this, we get that, or we don't have this type of emotional response. We know the person's going to be less guilty or less empathic, therefore it follows they will show this. If we see these decision-making deficits, we know the individual is much more likely to do impulsive or just not think, you know, not weigh up the consequences of their actions efficiently. When it gets on to suicide, especially with the base rate issue that Eric was very enthusiastic to make sure I knew about when we were having early discussions on this issue, I think it becomes very complicated. So I hope that was even remotely a useful answer.
Oh, Woody's been waiting here, then I'll get you. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Dieter Wolke from the University of Warwick in the UK. I might have missed something when you went quickly through on your empathic responsiveness, because the major results you reported is that they have got poorer emotion recognition, particularly in fear and sadness. But we find another group who just don't have the feeling state of empathy. That's a difference. They're actually better in perceiving fear and sadness in others, but they don't feel empathy of showing action. And that's a difference between conduct disorder children and those who use aggression or violence in an instrumental way. So that's I think it's perhaps an important point, and I think you might see it in a biomarker like neuroimaging as well.
I've got to say, I am deeply surprised about that. So, I mean, that data on the recognition impairment is extremely robust across lots and lots of labs. And we are talking about a relationship with instrumental aggression. This is conduct problems with instrumental aggression where this particular relationship is. The other reason that makes me a bit surprised is because there's quite a bit of data on the actual experience of empathy is reliant on that ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And it's got to be getting its information from somewhere. So a disconnect between those two, I think I'd need to have a strong peeky at your data. I do find that something there is good data with this population with the expression recognition problems also having clear problems with experienced empathy. I mean, Dustin Pardini is a whole bunch of people. I did some very early work with the naming of a generation of feelings towards these interpersonal harm stories way back when. Dustin Pardini has done something much more recent. The idea you get a disconnect there, it's neurobiologically difficult for me to compute, is what
I'm not, it's just a different group. You're talking about conduct
but my issue is that I'm trying to imagine how a healthy brain, how a brain could disconnect between those two. That's where I'm having the difficulty.
Okay, I am going to ask us to move on to the next one, but certainly James will be around today.
Yeah,
so
no, I'm
if you
around all
want to
day.
discuss more of them, that would be good. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Peter Donnelly from the University of St Andrews in Scotland. So two things very briefly. First, some hopefully real-world validation for what I thought was a fascinating talk, and secondly, a specific question. So the real-world validation is this. I speak to young men in Polmont, which is Scotland's juvenile jail, who've committed, very violent, sometimes fatal crimes, and I ask them why they did it, and they say things like, well, he looked at me funny. And it brings you up short because it seems so trivial and daft. But I think actually what they're saying is, I perceived a threat and I acted first in self-protection. And in fact, it's very, very common. And very few of those young men in jail for violent crimes will actually feel that they used instrumental violence. They will feel they used reactive violence, that they were justified in that which they did. The other thing is, if you look at them carefully, a tremendous number of them, and we've published a couple of papers on this, a tremendous number of them have ADHD symptomatology. It's grossly underdiagnosed, almost not treated in our jails, and there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on there. The final bit of validation is one of my PhD students, Anna Gavin, has just shown that certainly in schools on the west coast of Scotland, if you look at kids' attitudes towards violence, whilst most of them are not at all in favor of instrumental violence, they actually see reactive violence as just fine. In fact, it is what you should do. If somebody insults your mother, of course you should hit them. And so I think it's quite an interesting challenge, but quite exciting that all of this social stuff is coming together with an increased understanding of how the brain functions. Let me just ask one question, though, because as I said, I did find this fascinating. Is there any evidence yet that epigenetic changes can actually affect the functioning of some of these systems that you describe? Because it does seem to me that that's one potential way in which we could begin to link some of the social observations that you made on your second to last slide with the dysfunctionality of some of these brain systems.
So, good epigenetic data, I don't know of any. With respect to actually direct impact, it's not epigenetic impact, the data there is quite good. I will be surprised if there's not an epigenetic story as well. But bear in mind that, particularly when we start talking about diet, I only started bumping into these diet studies in the last 2 years. Before that, I used to tell I knew there was a social component to the callous and emotion component of problems, but the fact is we didn't have anything to say anything what it might be other than maybe poverty. And certainly not anything that would be having an impact at the biological level. Lots of impact to the expression, but not at the biological level. But then suddenly with the diet information coming forward, it suddenly changes. And yeah, indeed, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's epigenetic impact. And indeed, you're perfectly right about ADHD. With the ADHD, we roughly, in our sample of the kids that we work with, 65%, irrespective of their callous emotion, also meet criteria for ADHD. There's some very potentially important treatment implications with respect to that. I completely agree. Only one thing I might. So I think you've definitely got the individual who indeed is the threat response, looking at the funny that because they felt threatened. But a lot of it is, I mean, one of the best cases I saw back in England, I used to work mostly in prison with adults in England and more with kids now in America. But this guy was a member of a gang, and he had been sent by his gang to go and do somebody because they had upset the gang. When as he walked out of the pub, somebody knocked into him, and he stabbed them into death instead because he was so insulted that they walked into him. I mean, I'm sure there was a social frustration component to that, but I don't think he was really the threat side of things at all, because this was a guy who was relatively immune. I mean, he was one of the most flagrant examples of this problem I've ever encountered. But it does get back to the interesting thing of indeed the culture specifying what is and what is not appropriate behavior with respect to retaliation. Indeed, there's almost the sense that if somebody insults you, or insults a family member, even worse, particularly your mother, then that person is clearly not worthy any longer of the status of being, effectively, and definitely worthy at least of a slap or a punishment to get them back into line. So you've got, I didn't talk about this, but there's quite a nice set of architecture that is mediated when somebody violates your, they don't do expected things, they don't share money appropriately, or in this case, they don't actually behave appropriately. They're insulting your mother. And then you get a nice interaction between this decision-making architecture and that basic threat circuitry. The basic threat circuitry generates the anger. The decision-making architecture is effectively allowing you to evaluate an appropriate response. It will, and if the healthy individual, especially in the culture that pushes that, will, slap the person or maybe punch them or, but just respond in a calculated fashion to make sure the message is across. They won't lose respect within the group that they're in. Patient with these sorts of problems may go much too far and beat them to death or use a weapon when a weapon really is not called for. So you get these very, you see where this typical architecture that we all have and that is heavily socially modifiable. The very fact that we can choose who we declare to be victims is partly dependent on our culture. Okay,
we're going to go
Thanks
to
very much.
Elizabeth Ward for the last question.
Hi, very interesting presentation, but I'd just like to ask two things quickly. Have you looked at the impact of different treatment modalities? In other words, say you have a first-time offender who has one of these deficiencies. If we give them community sentencing with much more of a reward situation for good behavior, rather than a punishment situation of incarceration and withdrawal of benefits, do you see a difference? And the other thing that we have seen some very interesting data coming out, that when youth who are illiterate become literate, they seem to be able to manage their anger and control issues much better.
So there's definitely a good literature on, there are interventions, both, certainly psychosocial interventions that definitely reduce aggression levels and will be better indeed than a period of incarceration, which there's quite a lot of data to suggest that incarceration alone can increase aggression levels when the individual gets out. So no, that data definitely does exist. What I am interested in doing now, we've got, for me, what these represent is effectively biomarkers of problems that some individuals face. And so we can evaluate whether specific interventions benefit specific individuals. Will we see, say, a lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy type interventions that have been relatively efficacious in reducing aggression levels, whether they really, really work with that acute threat response individual, the hyper threat, as we've shown. When I sometimes give this type of talk, I show data where, certainly with treatment of PTSD, CBT type interventions do reduce that amygdala response to threat. They should, therefore, in this patient population who's showing that associated with reactive aggression, also see the decline in the amygdala response. We don't have that data, though, with conduct problems. Similarly, I'm extremely interested to see whether we can find interventions that benefit those youth who have these reduced response to the distress of other individuals. Can we bolster that up? Is it possible to do that with intervention? I'm not sure about that. Is it possible to do that with intervention plus pharmacotherapy? That does seem to be more plausible. And it relates a bit back to the question with respect to ADHD. There was a very nice study by a guy called Dan Washbush showing that intervention alone, at least behaviorally, didn't help this population who had these callous unemotional problems, low pro-social emotion problems, lack of guilt, lack of empathy. But if you coupled it together with methylphenidate, at least in this population that were ADHD plus conduct problems, then you suddenly saw significant benefit. So it may be that what we'll need to do is to find those individuals who have these reduced responsiveness to the distress of other individuals, bolster that architecture perhaps with pharmacotherapy, and then on top of that, give them the psychosocial interventions they'll need to learn that it's not, it's unpleasant to hurt other individuals because you can see their distress now, and that distress is making you feel bad when it's not really had the chance to make you feel bad in before. So what I really, for me, what I'm hoping, I think what we did over the last 5 or so years was to identify these biomarkers. Now my research is pushing as much as I can do within budget constraints to actually see whether current interventions existing actually have an impact on these architectures so that we can target interventions for individuals using effectively this approach of saying, look, this individual coming into the clinic has this type of problems. We should give this type of intervention to take out this problem and that problem, or at least to ameliorate the situation. Hopefully that was useful.
Thanks, James. Thanks very much for the talk and the question and answer.
And the movement, the lots of movement.
But I think it shows the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary nature of research now, where we're, now our basic scientists are intermingling with the people who are developing interventions, both psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy, to all work together to address the problems. And I think it's a really just exciting time in intervention research for that. Okay. Sure.
Mark presented a lot of data about the threat assessment in the general population. That is those without dysfunctional mechanisms in here. And people are way overestimating the risk, incredible overestimating the risk. We know a lot about changing that from a public health standpoint. People are using behavioral economics, for example. Those kinds of principles make major changes in perceptions of risk. And does do these basic neuromechanisms really have implications for public policy? Those public policy people who are really incredibly threatened and trying to put in draconian measures, for example.
So I need to be very cautious because I'm definitely not allowed to make any things about what that looks like a policy statement. So this is not a policy statement, otherwise all bad things happen to me. But I can give you some data. So I think when Mark was primarily talking with respect to schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, where indeed the impact is pretty small, the impact for this, particularly that population where I talked about with the callous unemotional traits, that impact is not small at all. So there's quite a bit of the sort of criminological literature showing that 5% of the population, 3% of the population commit 50% of the criminal behaviors that are shown. And I think that what I'm trying to get at with this sort of work is a good chunk of that 5%, that 3%. Not all of that 5%. I mean, there is no reason why there are clearly non-biological routes into relatively elevated levels of offending. But, so those callous unemotional traits correspond to psychopathy in adulthood. It's about 20–25% of the jail population. It's the population that when they're released from jail recidivate rapidly with extreme levels of violence. So addressing the issues that these individuals face, I think would benefit society. I certainly hope so, because otherwise I'm going to die being useless, which would really be depressing. So, that's my, I think it's going to work. I think we're going to have, whether I'm the one that's developing, whether somebody else is, but I hope that this work is going to indeed allow people to at least index the efficacy of interventions, and when those interventions, if they can be applied effectively, will give rise to very significant benefit for the individuals as well as the individuals around them. And I think it will be appreciable at a society level on the basis of stats like 5% do 50% of all crime.
Actually, the Kahneman would say that our brains are designed to underestimate some risks, overestimate other risks, and I don't know the solution to that. Even the studies that have been done in graduate students show that they're just as bad as everybody else. So, but it's an important thing to think about, because how do we get policymakers to think about the real risk instead of being caught up in the public, well, and also look at the public's response and the public perceived risk. But I'm sort of getting in the way of the fact that I have to let everybody go to lunch, but
I would
I'll let
just
you make
say
one
that,
more.
yeah, if we can, I mean, the fact is, this is really an empirical question. Right now, the interventions aren't fantastic. They do work, but they don't work as well as we'd like. And they don't work for this really particularly hardcore group terribly effectively. If we start getting interventions that work, I think that people will take notice of them, because, it has such an impact on people's existences.
Okay, I want to give people a heads up about lunch. We're breaking for lunch now. The lunch is right out here behind us. We are going to start again at 1 o'clock, because we have a video conference person that we're trying to include into the panel presentation. So you may take as much time as you want between now and 1, and you are welcome to bring your food back in here to have while we're doing that panel presentation.